everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Jenny and I'm here today to share with you my May reading wrap-up, starting off with my first finish of May, which was Eating Dirt, Deep Forests, Big Timber, and Life with the Tree Planting Tribe by Charlotte Gill. Okay, so in case you're not familiar with tree planters, because I don't know if everyone is, this is a kind of ragtag group of really hard workers that follow clear cuts that logging companies implement. So you can see kind of here in this picture, this is a clear cut. So the logging company will go in, they will pretty much decimate whole swaths of forest, and the tree planters are then hired to go in behind and replant trees. And so, as I was growing up, there was a lot of people I knew, young people in, the late 90s, early 2000s, who, and I think, people still do this, who would go and plant trees in northern regions, northern Ontario, different parts of British Columbia, following logging. And it's a really dirty and hard life, a job, because you're like carrying the trees in these big bushels behind you, and you're planting them. You have one hand with the shovel digging a hole, and the other hand's putting the tree in, and it's long days of very hard physical labor. And that's what this book is about. Charlotte Gill herself plants trees, or planted trees, for a very long time, and it's a seasonal job. So you would do it for 8 months out of the year, and then you'd have 4 months off. And so what this book is basically a memoir of that time and of this type of people that do this work and of how it works. And she writes it in a very we way. So everyone is, we feel exhausted by the end of the day. We, this, etc. It's not really an I. So she does use first person a little bit in some of the experiences, but it's mostly a collective experience that she's talking about in this book, which for me I found interesting, but ultimately found that it lacked any sort of personal detail about her. So she really removed, in a very journalistic way, I would say she removed any kind of really personal experience from this. She shares stories of things that happened to her while working and while in leisure in the time periods that she was working, but she doesn't really share her personal challenges with the job or her personal feelings around larger issues of deforestation or the work she was doing. She shares a lot of scientific information around trees, around the evolution of forests, around the ecosystem themselves. So I enjoyed it, and I think it's an interesting piece of history of a very specific type of work that is very niche and very probably unknown to a lot of people. So in that way, there's a lot of description of, the coastal areas of British Columbia, because most of her tree planting was done on Vancouver Island or near the coastal areas where clear cuts were happening. But if you're interested in looking at forests and trees and ecosystems from a different perspective, I would say that this is a good book to look at. And also, she doesn't have an agenda with this book. So she's not saying you shouldn't cut down trees. She's not saying you should cut down trees. She's just saying this was my job and this is what I did. And it's not a perfect thing, and it's complex, and there's lots of layers. So she tries to show that in this book by talking about there's a level of ambivalence that has to go along with this job. And there's lots of characters that she describes that she works with, and it's mostly a male-dominated profession, I guess, because it is so rugged. And although this book was published in 2011. So it is highly possible that there's more women in this industry now. I really don't know. But Charlotte Gill herself was one of very few women that do this job. So, take that as you will. So yeah, that is Eating Dirt by Charlotte Gill. And I will check in again with you when I have finished another book. Hey, everybody. Okay, I just finished the first novel of the month, Dreaming in Cuban by Cristina Garcia. Okay, so I contemplated DNFing this a couple times because I could tell probably, a quarter of the way in that it was not going to be a book that I loved. And I think especially when you've come off of a book the last novel I read I really loved, Cold Mountain. It's kind of unfortunate. You kind of have a bit of a book hangover, and then the next book has to try to live up to something. And this book just didn't live up to it, and I, found it just too disjointed for me. So we're following a Cuban family, mostly a mother, her two daughters, and their offspring. But there's other people in there too, other characters. And that was problem number one, is that there were just too many characters in this book. I couldn't keep everyone straight. I forgot a lot of things, and this isn't very long, right? So it's probably 240 pages, and somehow I couldn't keep the experiences of each character straight. So that was the first kind of issue for me. There were some voices that were stronger than others. So there is a granddaughter named Pilar, who I would say was the strongest voice in this story. And if I could have edited this book, I would have asked the writer to shift it to be her perspective, or to reduce it to dual perspective between Cecilia, who is the grandmother, and Pilar, who's as the granddaughter, and then work all the other characters into their experiences. There are some sections that are letters that Cecilia writes to a former lover, so not the grandfather and father of these offspring, which could have stayed in. It's fine. But this book was also supposed to kind of convey the history of the revolution in Cuba with, Batista, and then, kind of post Batista, and, covering, from the 1940s and 50s through to the 1970s, I think it ends in 1980. And one of the daughters defects from Cuba and goes to live in the United States and builds a life there, and is very much, in favor of the life of the United States versus a communist life in Cuba. And there's just so many aspects of that are explored in the story, I shouldn't say explored, they're touched on. So they're mentioned, they're, touched on, but they're not explored with any sort of depth. And so you end up feeling very all over the place. Like, you're learning about Santeria, the religion, like one of the, religions, but there's descriptions of things, of places, of, but also similarly the kind of Cuban diaspora in the United States, so mostly centered around New York City, but also in Miami. And again, it's just all very briefly touched on. There's like ghost story. It just felt like everything in the kitchen sink was thrown into this novel. And I found it like, I wanted to like it, but I just couldn't really feel connected to the characters. And there's a lot of kind of harsh things that happen. But again, like, I didn't retain them throughout the book, even though it's not a long book. And then I was getting to a point I was like, when did that happen to that person? And I couldn't remember. And I couldn't be bothered to go try to find it and remember, and locate it so that I could recall properly. So yeah, the story just didn't really stick with me. It didn't really feel cohesive. And I think that, it was a valiant attempt at telling a story like this, but it just was it was incoherent in places. The writing itself was fairly good, but again, it didn't have a level of consistency between the characters that I was hoping for, and that I needed and that I wanted for the story. So yeah, Dreaming in Cuban wasn't a successful one for me. And I will check in again with you when I have finished another book. Hey everybody. So I just finished my audiobook for the month of May, and that was Split Tooth by Tanya Tagaq. Tanya Tagaq is an Inuit author, singer, throat singer, more specifically. And this is her novel. So I actually thought that it was a memoir when I first learned about this book. I did not know it was a novel. And it is very much not a traditional novel. So it has a structure that is very vignette style, and it reads a lot like prose poetry, each snippet kind of encompassing a memory or a little vignette of childhood. Some of it is quite, a lot of it is quite serious and has trigger warnings around sexual assault and child abuse. And some of the things are a little bit or quite magical in terms of like bringing the North, Nunavut area, so northern Arctic territory, to life. So the seasons, nature, different animals, and then culture as well, and kind of, being a young girl going to school, the kind of inter-child politics of teasing, bullying, young love, young jealousy, those types of things. And then the last part of the story is very much, I would say, moves into magical realism. And you have our character who we've gotten to know through this whole thing, becoming awakened by her connection to the land, and that connection being kind of brought to life in the story through metaphor and through sexual metaphors and pregnancy and birth metaphors, and kind of, mystical beings being brought to earth. And I think it's also kind of relaying back to pain and, the result of trauma and things like that. So it's beautiful and heavy at the same time. There's also interspersed throat singing throughout. So listening to the audiobook in this one is really, I think, a benefit to listening to the story than to reading it, because you're not going to get the benefit of hearing her throat singing unless you happen to pull that up and listen to it yourself, and it won't kind of be placed in the same way. And I usually listen to audiobooks on 1.25 speed, but I put it back down to 1 because I didn't want to speed up the throat singing. I wanted to hear it as it was meant to be heard. And Tanya Tagaq narrates it herself and has a very breathy voice, and her you can tell that the stories are very embodied in her, and so the way she conveys the stories, I think, again, it's a very unique way to listen to them, and I think felt to me like the most authentic way to listen to hear the stories or to read them was to have her recite them herself. So yeah, I would say this is not an easy read. It is pretty traumatizing, and there's a lot of imagery that I think would be challenging to some people. So like sexual acts described through with kind of spiritual and maybe animistic. I'm not sure what the right word is to describe it, but I think for some people it would be too much. But I'm really, really glad that I finally listened to this. I think in terms of Inuit culture and, decolonizing my idea of storytelling and my idea of sexuality even, I think was definitely done through this novel. So I think that was really important, and I'm really glad that I read it. So yeah, that was my audiobook for May, and I will check in again with you when I have finished another book. Hi everybody. I just finished The Clay Girl by Heather Tucker. This is a novel, and I've had this on my TBR, my library TBR, for a very long time. So it was really nice to get to this. This is a very unique story. I have never read a story like this told in this way. And I have to say that when I first started it, I was a bit off-put by the narrative voice. So our narrative voice is Harriet Appleton, later to be Ari Appleton. And she is the youngest of 6 sisters to a very dysfunctional and abusive family. And so at first I was a little daunted because I have read a lot of novels this year with abusive fathers in them. And I don't know why that's happened. It's been kind of by coincidence. I really haven't planned it or realized that I've been reading these books, or planning to read these books. And this narrative voice and the way this story is told is completely unique. I've never read a book where someone is telling a story like this with so much lightness. So there's a lot of witty banter and quips worked into a very, devastating story of abuse, sexual abuse, physical abuse, neglect, and this story is so full of hope and beauty while also being so devastatingly dark. So I think that contrast is very unique. I've never read someone telling a story this way, where you are rooting for your main character so much, and she's just this person that lets the pain roll off of her like water off a duck's back, even though what she's enduring doesn't even seem physically possible. So there is a level of it's not magical realism, but there's a level of whimsy to this story that I don't know if everyone would like. And I did struggle with the narrative voice at the beginning when Ari was young, when she was 10. I think it opens when she's about 10 years old, and it moves through 6 years of her life and ends when she's 16. And there is a sequel to this book that wraps up the story. So this story is set in mostly Central and Eastern Canada. Quebec and Ontario is where she lives most of the time, and then she goes to Nova Scotia as well. Heather Tucker is an Ontario-based novelist. Ari has a lot of people around her that love her, while also having to deal with parents who are very broken and messed up people, and who take up their brokenness and their messed upness on their children. And there's a kind of a level of simplicity to some of the characters. They are kind of stereotypical. They are not given a lot of depth. So there's a lot of characters in here too. So I did feel at times where I struggled a little bit with just the names being brought up in a really fast pace and not remembering exactly who those people were, because she moves through many different scenarios. They're very large families. And the pace of the book is very fast as well. It moves quickly. You're going from plot point to plot point. She is very open and free, and, she sees the best in people, but she's also very wily. And I'm talking about Ari here, she encounters a lot of different types of people and tries to survive. She's a survivor. She also has an internal dialogue with Jasper, who is a seahorse. And basically, I think if you were coming at this from a trauma perspective, she found this seahorse, this internal dialogue, this internal voice, her soul, if you would want to call it that. She calls it kind of her soul animal. So an animal that represents who she is. And he is her internal dialogue voice. And so when she's young as a child, that internal dialogue voice is a little bit harder to discern, and it's a little bit it throws you off a little bit, or it threw me off a little bit. But once you get into the story, and then once she is older, Jasper becomes less of a dialogue point, and he's there, but he's seen as a survival mechanism for what she's been going through and the trauma of her life. So there is a level in this story of feeling like it's not real, like there's a surreal aspect to it, because there's just so much abuse that she endures, and it feels like that's not possible. It's also set in a very specific time period. It's set in the 1960s, and it also references Yorkville, which was the hippie area of Toronto in the late 60s, and that is an area that Ari is part of, and she works there, and a couple of her sisters are doing work there as well. So there's a lot of like local history and kind of specifics to that part of the world. And then also Nova Scotia as well is kind of this haven for Ari, and a place where she ultimately wants to end up. And so the book doesn't end with a clear-cut answer to how things work out for her, and I think that's why there was a sequel written. So I definitely will read the sequel. I struggled a little bit with whether to give this book 5 stars or 4. I would say this is a 4.75. I was really close to giving it 5 stars, and I may give it 5 stars later because I have a feeling this book will stick with me. I don't know what the hesitation is for me around 5 stars. I think it might be just, I did struggle at times with how brutal the abuse was and how lightly it was shared. And the other thing that I think about the writing that I would say didn't give it 5 stars for me was everything was this banter, witty responses, and people don't really talk like that in real life. So I guess there's a kind of, Ari writes in metaphors. She's very artistic. She's a good writer. She's a good painter. She's a good artist in general. And everything she says and writes is very poetic in some way. And I just found that she wasn't grounded in reality. So it felt a little bit like reading a fantasy story where you're it's not possible for this person to be real, for this person to endure what she's endured and to be who she is. So that kind of jump of belief for me left it not being a 5-star. But it's a really unique novel in that way. I would say, trigger warnings for all the things. I think if you come from trauma, I don't know if this would work for you as a novel or not. I guess you just have to try it and see. It might be something that makes you feel empowered. It might be something that makes you feel that not really, how do I put this? I'm not sure. I don't know, because I haven't had to deal with trauma, luckily, in my life. So I think if you have family trauma, this book might be triggering on many, many levels for you, especially because of the way Ari approaches things. It might be something where you feel somehow that you can't measure up to her, but because there are 5 other sisters who all have endured the trauma differently and who have different lives and work through it differently, maybe you would find yourself in one of the other sisters in the story. Okay, so that is The Clay Girl by Heather Tucker, and that is it for me for my reading for the month of May, and I will be back again soon with another video. Thank you so much for watching.